Hello and welcome to the comparison of the Hindustani classical raga and Western Impressionist music of the 19th and 20th century. I will begin with an overview of the context of Hindustani music, including the history of Hindustani music and the basic conventions of Hindustani music theory. I will then move to the context of Impressionist music, including parallels with the Impressionist visual art movement, key characteristics, and prolific composers of the movement. The links I will be exploring are the textural and rhythmic similarities between Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun composed by Claude Debussy and Raga Jog performed by Ravi Shankar. The origins of Hindustani classical music can be traced back to the Samaveda, an ancient Indian text likely compiled between 1200 and 1000 BCE. The Samaveda is a collection of Hindu scriptural chants which includes syllabic notation that specifies the rise and fall of the voice, but not fixed pitches. Although these chants were purely vocal, other texts allude to instrumental accompaniment with the chants, notes, and basic scales. The next major landmark in Indian music was the Natya Shastra, a treatise on dramaturgy written between 100 BCE and 100 CE. Music was an important part of early Indian theater. The Natya Shastra specifies grouping of instruments, stringed, covered, hollow, and solid, an octave composed of 22 micro-intervals, and 3 scales with 7 modes each. The first concrete reference to the raga form is found in Brihadeshi, written by Matanga, circa 700 CE. It gives reference to the raga as a sort of melodic pattern and discusses a system of ragas, although the concept of the raga had probably existed for centuries at that point. Through the Middle Ages, more treatises on music theory appeared, the seminal work being the Sangita Ratnakara, written by Sharngaveda in the 13th century, which codified much of the prior study of ragas and other elements of Indian music theory up to this point. Cultural exchange between the Hindu and Muslim worlds increased from the 13th century onwards. This was due to the advent of Islamic rule in northern India, whereby many Muslim rulers became interested in the local traditional Indian styles. The Muslim rulers' patronage of North Indian music was instrumental in causing two distinct styles of classical music to diverge: the North Indian Hindustani style and the South Indian Carnatic style. In North India, the Hindustani style developed in the royal courts as a combination of Hindu tradition and Persian influences. Amir Khusrau, a famous Sufi composer, is said to have composed new ragas which combine Persian and Hindu melodies and is sometimes credited as the inventor of the tabla. The two most prominent vocal genres of Hindustani music, Dhurpad and the more modern Khyal, as well as the semi-classical Sufi-style Qawwali, were developed during the period of Muslim rule. Moreover, many Muslim Mughal sovereigns supported the academic study of music, gathering experts for the compilation of treatises on theory. This divergence of styles was solidified in the court of Akbar, whose legendary musicians wrote music to eulogize patrons of the court. In the 19th century, Vishnu Narayan Bhatkande, an Indian musicologist, sought to abandon the old Raga Ragini system of ragas, in which ragas were personified iconographically as deities. He created the thought system of ragas, which significantly modernized Hindustani musicology by classifying ragas across 10 different thoughts or modes. The system of pitch classification in Hindustani classical music involves 22 shrutis or micro-intervals in an octave. There are 12 swaras or pitches that are used principally, and the semitones are used to add ornamentation through grace notes. The term sargam refers to a system of solfege used in Hindustani music. Sa, the starting note, is movable with no assigned frequency. There are tempered intervals, meaning that there is a difference in the size between each interval. There are 3 fundamental octaves or registers known as saptaks. The best performers can even go beyond these octaves. A raga is best defined as something with more specifications than a Western scale, but much more open than any song. Characteristics of the raga are that it has between 5 and 9 swaras or pitches, differing lines of ascent and descent, emphasized notes where ornamentation are allowed, and unique phrasing for each raga. Ragas are classified according to thought, and thoughts or modes may correspond with a Western church mode. In short, it is simply a framework for improvisation. The performance media of Hindustani classical music is one melodic voice, one rhythmic voice, usually the tabla, and one drone voice, usually a tanpuri. The texture is monophonic. The rhythm is defined by the tala. Different talas are paired with different ragas by the performers. The tala is a cyclical repeating rhythmic pattern played on the tabla. Different talas have different numbers of beats in one cycle. It could be 3, 4, 7, 10, 14, or more beats. There are two typical sections of the performance of a raga. The larger alap section is composed of 3 subsections, known as the alap, not to be confused with the larger section alap, the jor, and the jala. The alap features drone tones in the tanpuri, followed by slow, abstract, and rhythmless improvisation in melodic voice. The jor features increased speed in melodic voice, and small increasing to a large pitch range. The jala is the climax of the alap section, including fast and long melodic passages utilizing the full range of the instrument. The second section, the ghat, is composed of 2 sections. The ghat, not to be confused with the larger section ghat, is the entrance of the tabla performing the tala. The tabla interacts with melodic voice by performing improvised flourishes, which end is the beginning of virtuosic improvisation by the melodic voice. The second jala is the climax of virtuosity and complexity in the tabla and melodic voice, and includes a rapid tempo. The Impressionist style in Western classical music originated in the late 18th century as a style considered analogous to the Impressionist movement in the visual arts that had begun in the 1870s. The Impressionist era in music overlapped with the final decades of the Romantic era and was one of a number of styles that can be considered to be reactionary against the dramatic and dynamic emotionalism of Romanticism. Leading figures in Impressionist music include Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. Impressionism had profound influences on the modern period which followed it, as well as jazz music. It is essential to first understand the context of Impressionist visual art. French painters Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, and others created an art exhibition independent of the conservative and state-sponsored Salon exhibition. The painters shared an experimental spirit and tended to focus on portrayals of contemporary life and the use of diverse and vibrant colors to emphasize natural light, which was progressive for the time. Their paintings were sketch-like impressions that lacked finish and utilized small commas of pure color one next to another, which formed a recognizable image when viewed from a distance. Their work, as well as their defiance of the Salon, was highly controversial, and the group of artists was labeled the Impressionists by critic Louis Leroy. In music, the term Impressionism was applied by critics and was largely renounced by composers, namely Debussy. Nonetheless, there are many parallels. The exploration of color and natural light in Impressionist art was mirrored by an exploration of the unique timbre of different instruments in the orchestra. Impressionist orchestration often featured unusual and intimate combinations of instruments, particularly at soft dynamics. Additionally, Impressionist composers achieved color through colorful approaches to harmony, including the use of whole tone scales, parallel triads, extended chords such as ninths, elevenths, and thirteenths, church modes, chords of omission and addition, split thirds, quartal and quintal chords, planing chords, and unusual and sometimes unresolved cadences. Lastly, Impressionist music had topical similarities to Impressionist art, such as water, reflection, reverie, and other themes. In music, the Impressionist era lasted from about 1875 to about 1925. The most prolific composers of the era were Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, 2 French composers. Other notable figures associated with the Impressionist movement include Erik Satie, Paul Dukas, Isaac Albanese, Manuel de Falla, Ottorino Respighi, Jean Sibelius, Karol Szymanowski, and John Ireland. While Impressionist music is largely homophonic and Hindustani classical music is monophonic, the two styles share an important textural characteristic, a clear focus on a single melodic line. Music of the Impressionist era achieves the strong emphasis on a single melodic line through 1. The absence of competing melodic lines, such as counterpoint or polyphony, and 2. Sparse and minimalistic harmonization. This is similar to Hindustani classical music, whose texture also preserves the melody as the focal point of the piece. This texture is achieved through the instrumentation and performance media, which consists of a single melodic voice accompanied by a single instrument performing a cyclical rhythmic pattern and a single instrument performing a drone tone. The texture of most music of the Impressionist era can be described as homophonic with occasional monophonic passages, with a single melodic line supported by other voices outlining harmonies. Polyphony and counterpoint is largely absent in Impressionist music. In Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, a single voice carries the melody at all times. The melody is immediately apparent due to the sparse chordal figures played by the other instruments. For example, the first iteration of the flute motif is played in total monophony. Additionally, the second iteration of the flute motif is performed over sustained chordal figures in clarinets, violins, violas, and basses. The only other moving part is that of the cello. All of the instruments providing harmonic support play at a pianissimo dynamic and move largely in stepwise motion. This harmonization outlines harmonic implications, but importantly, does not distract from or obscure the melody, as seen below. Furthermore, it is important to note that the interaction between different voices retains a focus on a single melodic line. In Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, there is frequent call-and-response passages between voices. In call-and-response passages, voices will often trade off fragments of the melody, but these fragments do not overlap. Thus, the melody remains contiguous and focused, with no competing melodic lines, as seen below. In the above passage, the flute performs strict imitation portions of the clarinet motif. As this section concludes, a new, expressive, and sweet oboe solo begins a new section. This passage is significant in that it illustrates the lack of overlap between voices as they trade fragments of the melody. In each transition from one voice to another, there is no more than an eighth note played simultaneously. In practice, this preserves the continuity of a single melodic line. For example, the C sharp performed by the flute at the downbeat of rehearsal number 4, in unison with the C sharp performed by the oboe, creates a seemingly uninterrupted melody, marked only by the change in tone color. The texture of all traditional Hindustani classical music is monophonic, featuring a melodic line, typically performed by a vocalist or on a sitar, sarod, bansuri, or shanai, a drone instrument, typically a tempuri, and a cyclical rhythmic pattern, typically performed on a tabla. The piece which will be referred to in this analysis is Ravi Shankar's 1956 recording of Raga Jog. Raga Jog is typically classified as belonging to the thought or mode of Kafi. As a monophonic style of music, the melodic mind is ostensibly obviously the focal point. The drone tones performed by the tempuri, as well as the cyclical rhythm performed on the tabla, have no melodic interest or direction. The ostinato performed by the tempuri simply establishes the tonality of the piece and has no harmonic implications. The following passage is an approximated notation of the drone passage ostinato appearing at the beginning of the recording of Raga Jog. In summary, Hindustani classical music and Western Impressionist music have different textures, but both achieve a similar effect. Each texture creates an unobscured focus on melody. In Hindustani classical music, this is achieved through the use of a single melodic soloist without any vertical harmony. The drone only indicates the tonic, and tablas are not melodic. Additionally, in Impressionist music, the use of sparse chordal figures and intimate combinations of instruments help to create a texture that creates an unobscured focus on melody. Both Hindustani classical music and Impressionist music are most easily described as rubato in terms of rhythm. While both styles feature fixed meters, a strong pulse or meter is frequently eschewed in favor of free-flowing and fluid rhythmic figures. In Impressionist music, this is achieved by slurs and ties across bar lines that obscure the downbeat, as well as the ebbing and flowing of the tempo, which occurs at the discretion of the conductor and the players. In Hindustani music, this is achieved through the alap section of the raga, which has no fixed meter, as well as the free-flowing nature of the improvised melody, which does not necessarily align with the cyclical tal performed by the tabla. Melodic lines in Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun are sometimes tied or slurred across bar lines, which makes the tempo, meter, and downbeat more difficult to identify for listeners. This is found in the first flute motif, in which the dotted quarter note in the third measure is tied to the first eighth note of the fourth measure. Additionally, a rubato style of playing is used to eschew the tempo in favor of stylistic effect in most recordings. Melodic lines tied across bar lines appear in several other instances throughout the piece. The most notable evidence of rhythmic fluidity in Hindustani classical music is the segment of traditional raga form known as the alap. The alap section features only the drone and melodic voice without the tabla, and involves free improvisation by the melodic voice within the specified ascending and descending lines of the raga. The alap section has no meter whatsoever and serves only to introduce and explore the raga. In Ravi Shankar's Raga Jog, the alap section lasts from the beginning to 13 minutes and 3 seconds. In this section, the sitar begins with the sustained notes and intermittent ascending and descending runs within the notes of the raga. While the improvised melody gradually becomes more metrically defined, it is not until the beginning of the tala after the introductory tabla solo from 1303 to 1322 that the piece takes on a truly defined meter. The introduction of the tabla is also significant to rhythmic fluidity in that it lacks a defined meter. The tabla, at the end of the alap section, performs a brief solo, which is a display of virtuosity involving rapid, varied strokes with no defined meter. This occurs, as previously mentioned, from 1303 to 1322 in Raga Jog, at the conclusion of the alap and before the tala is introduced. In short, tempo, meter, and rhythm are obscured in both Hindustani classical music and Impressionist music. In Impressionist music, this is achieved through slurs and ties across bar lines and a rubato and espressivo style of playing heard in recordings. In Hindustani classical music, there is a meterless free rhythm of the alap section played by the melodic instrument, such as the sitar, as well as virtuosic flourishes played by the sitar and the tabla. To conclude, the links I explored in this musical links investigation were textural similarities and rhythmic fluidity, and how they are similar between Hindustani classical ragas and Western Impressionist music. In terms of texture, Hindustani classical ragas are monophonic, while Impressionist music is homophonic, sometimes featuring monophonic passages. Both textures achieve the effect of creating a focus on a single melodic line. In terms of rhythmic fluidity, both musical cultures achieve an obscured and fluid sense of rhythm. Hindustani classical ragas lack meter and defined rhythm in the alap section and feature meterless flourishes on the tabla. The Impressionist music of the Western Hemisphere features rubato playing styles and slurs and ties across bar lines that make tempo and downbeat difficult to discern.